Okay, so like, at what stage did you get involved in the development of the Super Duke?
Really early. I was invited to a test that they had on a very first pre-production model that was completely different than this bike. It looked completely different.
How was it different? Was the chassis different as well? And,
no, the chassis was the same. It's just that you know what something that's been made up, like with plastics that aren't.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
They've been used off other bikes, etc. And the biggest difference you notice is the single-sided swinging arm.
All right.
And we tested that quite extensively. Put a lot of mileage on that.
Okay.
Just basically.
Was it mostly on a racetrack?
It's all on a road.
All on the road.
And then it developed from there. Slowly, I got to test the next one, which we tested at a facility in Spain behind closed doors, and all of those initial teething problems that we found with the first bike were ironed out for the next test bike and so forth. And then we decided to basically start with a clean sheet of paper for the chassis geometry, suspension. Worked very closely with WP suspension and Bosch electronics.
When you test on the road, is the actual, like, for example, when you test and you work on a swing arm, is the actual mileage actually important? Is it just a certain bit of a road and you just check how it behaves? And is it enough to go 5-minute rides and feel the difference? Or you need to go through a certain process of, I don't know, a certain mileage?
I don't have to do, thankfully don't have to do the high mileage tests,
Sure.
but when they come up with a new concept like a single-sided swinging arm, it's never been tested before within the company. It needs to be comprehensively tested to 50,000 kilometers or 60,000
Right.
kilometers. That's what they were doing with the first bikes, and I joined them during that test, and that's really where my involvement started. I only came down to give first impressions, and I gave them a list of what I liked and didn't like, and from that I was invited back to do the development work with them for the bike.
But being like an ex-Grand Prix star, I mean, you come in and you look at the road bike, and you're trying to make it very sporty.
No, everybody thinks that's what I'll do. Because your background is racing, you think you're going to turn it into a race bike, and actually, complete opposite for me. I want my road bikes to be road bikes.
Right.
I actually made the bike less sporty than it was first starting out to be. And I mean by that, foot peg position and riding position. I changed it to be more of something that I would like to ride up through the mountains or take on the racetrack. It has to do both. But the list that we were given to tick off, so to speak, on what the bike's got to do was quite comprehensive as well. It had to be very neutral.
Right.
Had to be very well balanced. We couldn't have any self-steering tendencies. Basically it had to be a completely rounded package that anybody can ride anywhere. I hope that's what we come up with, but it was the fun part for me was actually doing a lot of the road development, because that's completely new to me. I've never developed a road bike. I've changed plenty of race bikes and altered them to suit my style, but when we test as a road rider, we have to test like Joe Blogs,
Sure. Yeah.
And when we take it onto the track, we can ride it as we want. So the bike has to work in both scenarios, and I suppose the interesting part for me was the work with the electronic side after we got the geometry right.
Right.
Because when we got the geometry right, the R&D department tested very. I mean, as much as I tested, all of the guys in that R&D department also tested. They tested as much as me. There's something that doesn't work for one rider. It's noticed. They're really experienced riders. They've got low-level experience to very, very high-level experienced riders. And once we got the geometry right, we had to start working with Bosch for the traction control and the ABS.
When you started working on geometry, was the engine pretty much in its final shape?
Yeah. They knew what they wanted from the engine. They knew the figures that they could achieve.
Is there a threat, like normally, I'm not talking about Super Duke now, but let's say you work on a geometry and you're happy with it, and then the engine changes. I mean, we're talking about road stuff, and then the engine changes its characteristic. Will that affect geometry?
No, not really. Only if you add a huge amount more torque or power to a bike.
Okay.
Of course, you're going to get more transfer to the rear. That would be the, I suppose, the only downside of changing the engine or developing the engine quite radically from something that you've started with. But this engine didn't change. This engine was the engine that I tested with. It already was making those big figures, 145 Newton meters, when I first tested the very first bike.
Is now the Super Duke? Is it the bike pretty much now what you wanted it to be when you?
It's for me. It's a package that works. It doesn't. I suppose that's really up to the rider. Does he like the bike or not? We like what we've got. We know the bike very well. That what you've got right now is the finished product. We can't change that. There's nothing more that we can add to it. Sure, there's some power parts and dongles and things that they're talking about producing that gives the rider more control over his preferred setting, to store his preferred setting. You're going to test a version that we've set up for the racetrack tomorrow, which is a little bit different in terms of throttle response. It's a more direct throttle response. It's got a traction control setting for the slip tire, and it's got aftermarket suspension on it. Okay. So for not an awful lot more, you can change the bike to suit the track as well.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, we achieved everything we wanted to achieve during the development.
All right. Okay. Cool. All right. Thanks, buddy.
All right.